live now to remarks from Senator Marco Rubio. He is delivering the keynote address this afternoon at the Conference on the Americas in Washington, D.C. Senator Rubio chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere.
I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Senator Marco Rubio, and welcome the members of his team. During his time in the Senate since 2011, Senator Rubio has been a strong advocate for shared prosperity and economic growth throughout the hemisphere. As a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he plays an instrumental role in developing and influencing U.S. foreign policy across the world, while remaining particularly vested in growth and developments in the Western Hemisphere. As chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere, transnational crime, civilian security, democracy, human rights, and global women's issues, Senator Rubio works to advance a common agenda and shared values that the United States has with the region. He has been a leading voice on human rights and democratic principles in the hemisphere, in Cuba and in Venezuela. And as a Venezuelan American married to a Cuban American, it's something that I particularly appreciate. Senator Rubio's values are rooted in his family's achievements, from humble origins, from his parents' arrival to this country in 1956, to earning their way into the middle class. Then, this was consolidated by Senator Rubio's then considered unlikely Senate victory against a much favored primary opponent. These experiences have shaped a courageous leadership and steadfast determination to tackle deep-rooted challenges, and leading really to his bursting on the national political scene as a presidential candidate in 2016. Mr. Senator, we thank you for your leadership on issues of such great consequences for the United States' relations in the Western Hemisphere and your friendship with the Council of Americas. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So about a month ago, I had to buy these at Walgreens. Something happened overnight. My eyesight started to deteriorate. Is that normal after you turn 45? All right, I just want to make sure. But anyway, I'm really honored to be with you here today. It's begin by thanking the Council of the Americas for inviting me to speak. And it's actually a great honor to be here with you in this Benjamin Franklin room, which is a hallowed place. It's named after one of our founding fathers. It's also named after the father of international diplomacy in the United States. So in particular, I want to begin by thanking Andres Gluski, who's chairman of the Council, the Americas Society, and Susan, the president and CEO of the Americas Society, and of course Eric Farnsworth, who will actually be before our subcommittee tomorrow. So hope you get a good night's sleep. We're going to grill you hard. Anyway, it's an honor to be a part of this conference. I think this is actually an exciting time with regard to the United States and the Western Hemisphere, because it gives us an opportunity to rethink policy in many ways outside of normal convention. Let me begin by saying I think there's been, certainly since the end of the Cold War, a lack of focus at some of the highest levels of our government in the hemisphere. And that's something that needs to be reversed quickly, because in the end, our future, both economic and security, is deeply tied to our region. And I say our region because we're a member of this region. Oftentimes when we talk about the Western Hemisphere, we talk about something that's happening somewhere else. We are a part of that. Certainly, if you live where I do in South Florida, you know full well you are a part of it, both economically, culturally, socially, and politically. And so it's an opportunity to be with you here today. What I wanted to take is an opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts gathered over 5 years, 6 years in the Senate, really spending a lot of time. And let me just begin by saying I'm troubled that oftentimes U.S. foreign policy in general and U.S. foreign policy towards the Western Hemisphere in specific is tactically driven versus strategically driven. This is especially true throughout the world, by the way, but we spend a lot of time discussing tactics, sanctions or no sanctions, military action or no military action, diplomatic engagement or no military. Those are tactics, but if they're not in furtherance of a strategy, you're wasting a lot of time. And so I do not pretend to have the all-knowing strategy on how to pursue the Western Hemisphere, but I do know that we have ideas that we intend to share with the new administration, with the people who work in this building, and with my colleagues in the United States Senate and with each of you here today. And so while these are not necessarily universally accepted concepts of a strategy, I think they lay the groundwork for a way forward that I don't believe is either partisan, nor in many cases should be controversial. Let's begin by constructing the three pillars of what I hope our engagement in the region will be built on. The first is obviously our safety, security, our national security. The second is expanding economic prosperity. And the third is defending our values. All three are equally important. They are not ordered in any particular way, and they are all interrelated. It is actually impossible to do any of the three without the other two. So let's begin first to talk about how do we keep America safe in the Western Hemisphere. In my view, it begins by countering illicit flows. As many of you are painfully aware, Central America has the highest homicide rates in the world, and citizens of the region have been fleeing in droves, often here to our country. Cubans fleeing the island also added pressure to transit countries in Central America and Mexico, as well as the U.S. border. And these migrant flows, as well as cartel networks in the region, have created a thriving business for smugglers. In addition to strengthening border security and enforcing immigration laws, we need to ensure that we are partnering with the source countries to stem these flows, which can be ultimately exploited by transnational groups, by terrorists, by others who are trying to bring illicit items, not just people, but items into the United States. So what would a strategy that tries to counter illicit flows look like? It begins by working with Mexico and with Guatemala to tighten their own border security, perhaps by using our existing U.S.-Canadian programs and having U.S. law enforcement agencies partner directly with our counterparts in Mexico if they invite us to do so, and working with other willing partners in the region to enhance their border security at key transit points as well, by using the Department of Defense's Train and Equip Authority to help build capacity with our foreign partners in Central and South America, by revitalizing the Coast Guard's shipbuilding budget to ensure adequate Coast Guard cutter presence in the Caribbean and in the Eastern Pacific for interdiction efforts, by providing U.S. Southern Command with greater resources for partnership engagement training, by convening regional discussions on how to dismantle the human smuggling networks. And in fact, it's my understanding that in June of this year, the Department of Homeland Security will host one such gathering of foreign ministers from the Northern Triangle, as well as some other countries, to discuss this and other issues of importance. By reassessing the Alliance for Prosperity, which I support, but reassessing it to ensure it's not replicating the mistakes we've made in the past in other programs, that the aid is adequately conditioned, and that controls are in place to prevent waste and corruption, something that, by the way, the recipient countries asked for as well. Given the possible shift of cocaine processing from Colombia to Central America as a result of Peace Colombia, we should prioritize security funding using lessons learned from Plan Colombia and encouraging Colombian and Mexican military training exercises with Northern Triangle countries. By focusing our assistance on the region on developing institutions key to security, including the court system, public prosecutor offices, police forces, with a special emphasis on Mexico, building on successful aspects of the Mérida Initiative. By helping countries in the region tackle corruption by strengthening their anti-money laundering and asset forfeiture laws and enforcement capabilities. By supporting anti-corruption initiatives like the MACHI in Honduras, and the CICIG, which I'm not sure has an acronym. Is it CICIG? All right, sounds good to me. And by holding countries that are not cooperative, like Bolivia, that are not living up to their international drug control obligations accountable, and making clear that U.S. assistance could be affected if they do not produce and implement a counter-narcotics plan. By working with Colombia and Peru to resume aerial eradication of coca plants, to reduce cocaine production and trafficking, by working with Colombia and Mexico to aggressively eradicate poppy crops in the hemisphere to reduce the heroin entering the United States, by fully utilizing all legal tools that target narco traffickers and their assets, including the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act. Security also means addressing the reality of outside actors. We are focused on global crisis throughout the world. Many external actors have, in the process, attempted to gain a foothold in our own hemisphere. International terrorist groups who have exploited criminal networks for purposes of raising money could also use these networks one day to access U.S. territory. The region, sadly, has not been immune to the rise of ISIS and other militant groups, as our friends in Trinidad will talk to you about. And we all U.S. adversaries and sometimes foes, including China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, have sought to exploit anti-American sentiments of some in the region. To counter these disturbing trends, there are a number of things that we should do. First, we should make adequately clear that the United States does not expect other countries in the region to trade solely with us, but that we will not allow our enemies, enemies of security, prosperity, democracy, and human rights, to establish a foothold in the region. To speak out and to support pro-American leaders, pro-democracy leaders, responsible leaders who seek to deepen cooperation with the United States, and to make clear that America is not going to leave a vacuum in the region for others to fill. By utilizing bilateral free trade agreements or other trade agreements to increase U.S. economic engagement in the region, including by leveraging the economic power of our allies in Asia, and where possible, by assisting U.S. companies to bid for sales, military sales in the region. Increasing U.S. increase our reporting on and monitoring of the activities of non-state actors in the region, by deepening intelligence cooperation and military relationships with key Latin American partners, and assist those, such as Argentina, for example, that take countering outside influence seriously, by working to build the capacity of smaller states, as I mentioned, like Trinidad and Tobago, that face challenges in this area, and by prioritizing our engagement in multilateral organizations such as the Organization of American States, while at the same time standing up to organizations that deliberately exclude the United States. That's the first pillar of our security. But that alone will not be enough. In fact, that alone will not be possible until we do the other two things. The second would be expanding our economic prosperity and that of our neighbors, because it is not a zero-sum game. Greater economic opportunity for our neighbors not only makes it less likely that migrants would come to the United States in a way that's illegal or irregular, but it actually helps build these economies that become consumer and trade partners with us. In the absence of the TPP, we need robust trade and economic agenda for the hemisphere that makes clear to our partners that China and other actors are not the only, should not be an alternative to the U.S. market. And so this talks about things like forging closer economic ties with countries, including through FTAs that prioritize free market reforms and tackle corruption, and help our partners who enact free market policies connect and deepen their economic relationship with U.S. allies in Asia and other regions. By modernizing NAFTA, but ensuring that the process of doing so does not send the message that the United States is closed for business. Prioritizing strengthening of intellectual property protections, stricter labor standards, the elimination of non-tariff barriers, such as inconsistent custom procedures. But make clear that NAFTA modernization is not hostile to Mexico or Canada, but in fact is designed to be beneficial to all three of us. Accelerate the growth of a robust regional private sector through what I call through a presidential level initiative called the America's Economic Freedom Initiative, to show partners in the region that there is not a need to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. This would not be based on foreign assistance, but would find ways to incentivize capital markets and other measures to develop a regional community independent in the production and distribution of a range of products and services, interdependent, in the production and distribution of a range of products and services, particularly energy, allowing smaller countries to become less reliant on, for example, the Maduro regime for their energy needs. And in that vein, partner with our Caribbean neighbors to develop alternative sources of energy so they too can reduce their reliance on the Maduro regime. The second aspect of helping with economic growth is to fight corruption by making common cause with a generation of new leaders that are battling corruption in countries like Guatemala and Argentina, the opposition leaders in Venezuela, the Brazilian civil society actors, by publicly speaking out about the cost of corruption, especially to the poor in the region, as well as to American exporters. By replicating the U.S.-Colombia Advisory Council on a regional level, bringing together business leaders and anti-corruption experts to discuss corporate governance, rule of law, and ethics, including countries like Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Peru, nations that are open, active, and looking forward to being engaged in initiatives such as this. And by reinvigorating the International Anti-Corruption Agreement of the OAS and the OECD, and use financial tools to impose sanctions for individuals and national noncompliance. The third, which is the one I spent a significant amount of time on, is defending our values. And for me, that begins by standing up to dictators and standing up for freedom and for democracy. I fear, quite frankly, for the better part of 30 or 40 years, too much time has been used to placate hostile governments. During the Cold War, we looked the other way as right-wing dictators took power and abused on their people in the hopes of keeping out the Soviet Union. In the 21st century, we've too often looked the other way or outright neglected, as democracy and the rule of law have been canceled in places like Venezuela, like Nicaragua, like Ecuador, like Bolivia, and sadly, for almost 7 decades, Cuba. Presidential messaging and leadership is critical and needed to reverse the perception in the region that the United States is tougher on its allies than it is on its adversaries. And that's why I hope that we will, in a strategic way, recalculate the concessions that have been made to a dictatorship in Cuba, and that we will also finally begin to pressure the Maduro government in Venezuela to follow its own laws, to hold an election, to recognize its National Assembly, to respect the right of its people to assemble and speak freely. In the end, the solution to Venezuela is one election away. There is no way the Maduro regime or anyone associated with their government can get elected to anyone. And all we ask for is that that elections be followed. I think it's important to also diplomatically isolate countries that repress their people and that refuse to work constructively to tackle these regional challenges. In that vein, it is critical that from this building, from Congress, and throughout government, we place democracy and human rights at the core of United States foreign policy in this region and throughout the world to ensure that our assistance programs reflect this. But I believe we need to robustly engage at the Organization of American States to rescue the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which was neglected for far too long by presidents in both parties, and make clear to our partners that they will also be expected to speak out, as many now are doing in Argentina, in Brazil, in Mexico, in Colombia, in Peru, in Chile. Speak out when their neighbors are violating the rights of their own citizens. It's critical in this vein as well to reassure our allies. For far too long, I believe we've neglected many of our traditional partners in the region. We need to build on the deep ties we have with countries like Canada and Mexico, Colombia, and grasp the new opportunities that have presented themselves in Peru, in Brazil, in Argentina, just to name a few. In particular, I believe Canada can play a key role in helping to promote security, prosperity, and democracy in the region. And partners like Colombia and Mexico have great potential to expand their engagement within and outside of the hemisphere. That's why, again, I go back to it, but I think we need to empower the Organization of American States to fulfill its mission, as stipulated in Article 1 of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. I believe we need to develop new policy planning discussions with key partners in the region to discuss regional as well as global challenges. We need to engage more frequently with regional partners and international fora on issues unrelated to the Western Hemisphere. By establishing new military-to-military engagements with Brazil, Peru, Argentina, and by expanding on our current engagements with Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Panama, Uruguay, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, including expedited military sales to encourage acquisition of what I believe is the superior U.S. equipment, and our allies also agree. By expanding existing Southcom and Northcom relationships, exercises, and programs to formalize military cooperation and security cooperation within the region. By reassuring the Colombian people that the United States supports the implementation of Peace Colombia, but that it will be conditioned on full compliance of the agreement by the FARC. And we will work with the Colombian government, the democratically elected government chosen by the people of Colombia, to ensure that crimes committed by the FARC do not go unpunished and the victims are adequately compensated. And finally, by reassessing U.S. assistance program in the region and ensure that our aid efforts are actually having the desired impact in places like Haiti, and that factors such as corruption are not undermining the effectiveness of our support. We must make clear that despite these fiscal constraints that we face here in Washington, D.C., the United States is willing to continue to support those partners, and that commit to dealing with security challenges, that respect democratic norms and the rule of law, and that the United States and that support these broader issues in the international fora. That's a lot to digest. I know it reads almost like a PowerPoint. It almost became one. But I wanted to get that on the record because, as I said earlier, so much of the things that we want to do are guided by tactics. And the one point I try to make to my colleagues is that more often than not, I said this last night about Colombia at a great gathering that we were able to have at the ambassador's residence, that more often than not in the Western Hemisphere, our allies in the region are an answer, not a problem. That more often than not, we are more linked than we believe. Now, obviously the media doesn't cover the Western Hemisphere as much as it once did. Much of the global attention is paid to North Korea or what's happening in Syria, and rightfully so. These are issues of incredible global importance. But I think the extraordinary opportunities that exist in this hemisphere for a 21st century of shared prosperity are extraordinary. And perhaps it's because I live in Miami that I've seen it firsthand. I remember vividly, my wife is of Colombian descent, and so I remember vividly the 1990s where not only was traveling to Colombia to visit relatives out of the question, but in fact there was always the fear that someone you loved could be next, losing their lives in a bombing, not because of political engagement, because they happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And through much effort, blood, sacrifice, and with American assistance, the people of Colombia went from being on the verge of a failed state to perhaps our strongest regional partner in South America today, and one of the most capable, perhaps, in the world. All of that is the result of U.S. engagement, not U.S. disengagement. And again, the bulk of that responsibility fell on the Colombian people and its leaders, and they lived up to that responsibility. But we helped, and it wasn't charity. It helped us too. And you see it every single day in South Florida. And the planes and containers that arrive full of flesh flowers that are then shipped through logistics run by Americans or Colombian Americans or Americans in general from our airports and seaports, creating extraordinary economic opportunity. You see it in the tourists that fly into Orlando from Argentina and Brazil and Venezuela and Colombia, I apologize. But you also see it in the decline in visitors and prosperity in places like Venezuela, one of the richest resource countries on the planet, where the average Venezuelan, according to a recent report, lost 19 pounds in the last year. And it wasn't a result of exercise or diet. It's a result of economic calamity and disaster. And so you see right there in two bordering countries the distress of bad governance and bad policy and the opportunities of good leadership and economic engagement. This is what we hope for the region. This is important. It's in our benefit as a nation. And I can tell you, if 40, 30, 20 years from now, we live in a hemisphere where we have more countries, like Mexico with a growing middle class, like Colombia with, despite its challenges, growing security and trade opportunities, like Brazil, which has now gone through its constitutional process and hopefully will be able to move forward, like Argentina, which is embracing the free market and the opportunities it brings with it. Would life in America be more prosperous and safer, or less prosperous and less safe? Everyone in this room knows the answer. But it begins by prioritizing this from the highest levels of government. And so my hope is that from our perch in the United States Senate, it's not much of a perch, but from our seat in the United States Senate, from our subcommittee, and from our engagement in forums such as this, that we can encourage more of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle to engage in the Western Hemisphere and to care about it at every level. Because I think the opportunities for our nation, for our region, and ultimately for the world are truly extraordinary. And the great thing about it is, because we haven't been debating it for far too long, as of now, anyways, there are no partisan lines. There are no pre-existing positions. It's an open and blank slate in many ways, and it allows us to write it in a way that benefits America and Americans, meaning the broader region. And I thank you for the importance you've always given it and continue to give it in highlighting this. And my hope is that in the years to come, as we come back and engage with you, that many of the ideas that you're producing and that we've offered are becoming reality, and the fruits are out there for all to see. So again, I thank you for this extraordinary opportunity to address you. And I look forward to continuing to hear from you, learn from you, work with you, and achieve prosperity together with you and with our partners in the region. Thank you very much. I'm almost through. Yeah. About 10 minutes.
Well, Senator, thank you for that compelling and thoughtful vision of U.S. engagement and collaboration in the hemisphere. Now we have a few minutes for Q&A. People will be circulating with mics, so just please raise your hand if you have a question. Yes, Alejandro, the mic will be coming.
Thank you for your time and for letting us be here with you. You mentioned in your first part of your speech the relevance, and I couldn't agree with you more, of what corruption does with countries. I'm from Mexico, and it's definitely one of our biggest challenges. One of the things that's feeding corruption, as you very well know, is narcotráfico. I'm sure you know about supply and demand. So you didn't mention anything about the fact that in the U.S. is really where the drug is consumed. The guns that are killing Mexicans come from the U.S., and the money is also coming from the U.S. through the border. Do you have any reflection on that, and what can you do for it?
No, it's a very valid point. And I don't talk about it in the speech because I kind of limited it to the, and you're right, maybe we should re-examine that as part of our Western Hemisphere strategy. You know, the first has always been true. Sadly, America has been the market of choice for consumption for cocaine, obviously marijuana, cocaine, and now opiates and heroin, and that remains the case. And the other reality that we're now facing is that as many of these nations have become more prosperous, consumption has increased internally as well, so it's become a joint a problem in that regard. And to that, I would say a couple points. We now are facing this opiate crisis in the United States, and it is part of our, in fact, just today, as part of my appropriations role, is continue to seek full funding for programs, not just to prevent addiction to opiates, which often begin through the prescription medical route, but also to help treat people as a medical condition. The fact of the matter is, and the medical research on it is as clear as can possibly be, if you are addicted to an opiate, your ability to break free from it, absent military intervention, listen to me, absent medical intervention, yeah, airstrikes against opium, is almost none. And the problem is, for most people, those resources don't exist. So we've tried to work it from the ground up in Florida, because ultimately where these problems are manifesting themselves is at the local level. People become addicted, they wind up in the emergency room, they save your life with Narcan, and then you're back out on the street, and they're seeing some of the same people 6, 7 times a week, multiple times a day, who are overdosing now on street heroin. So addressing that, absolutely, we've got to cut off the demand part of it. And the supply part of it is important because of the things that it breeds. The problem is that as soon as you cut off one substance, it migrates to another. So this will be an ongoing challenge for us moving forward. But you're fair to point out that I neglected to mention that that is a big part of this endeavor, and that is the demand side. And I would venture to guess that in the years to come, sadly, in some ways, as nations become more prosperous, they will too see an uptick in consumption in the hemisphere, and so we may need to be working with them hand in hand on developing best practices in that regard as well. But you're absolutely right to point that out. Where's the microphone?
Microphone's there.
I don't.
I'll go ahead and ask a question.
Okay, good. Just so comprehensive, I know.
I guess my question is, what we're seeing in Venezuela is a humanitarian disaster. And you know, the unfolding of this is uncertain. But really, what is the sort of planning for a total sort of collapse in this humanitarian disaster that's going to take resources from the region?
Well, that's a great point. And first of all, I spent a lot of time, I don't mean this in a condescending way, a lot of time explaining to my colleagues the nature of the issue in Venezuela, because the traditional issue in many countries is you've got a government in power, you've got a civil society against them, and they're in this loggerheads. The issue in Venezuela is a little different. You actually have a National Assembly elected by the people of Colombia despite rampant fraud against them, who have basically been canceled. So the way I explain it to them is, imagine if the president tomorrow called down and said, I'm cutting off your funding, I don't care what laws you pass, we're not going to put them into place, we're not going to pay you any salaries, you don't even have money for ink, pens, paper, anything, and we're just going to ignore the National Assembly and any laws that you pass. That's the state of affairs. And then imagine if they said, and by the way, we're kicking out every independent news outlet, and the one that remained, I'm going to get my good friend to buy it so they can report my side of it. And then imagine if on top of that you invited a foreign power, in this case Cuba, to come in and take over your intelligence gathering, your passport operation and the like, because you don't, in some ways, trust your own people to do it. because you don't think they'll oppress their own people if push comes to shove. That's the situation we now face. So the demands of the opposition in Venezuela, we say the opposition, they're the majority in the National Assembly, is very simple. Under the Constitution put in place under Hugo Chavez, they're supposed to have elections this year. Hold the elections. Under the Constitution, if you gather a significant number of signatures, there has to be a presidential recall. They ignored it. Under the Constitution, it's supposed to be elections a year from now for the presidency. Hold that election. In essence, follow your own laws. That's their ask. And that's being ignored. And so I've been very pleased to see nations in the region take leadership on this. I really have. I mean, it's been one of the most uplifting experiences to see Mexico, Argentina, Chile, others, just stand, Peru, Colombia, stand firmly, and a growing number of nations joining that, and in Central America as well. You talk about the humanitarian crisis, that already exists. So last week I filed a bipartisan bill to create a fund and authorize a fund that would be available of assistance to help the transition in Venezuela, given the disaster they now face. And what that means is there's two reasons for it. One is to help the people in Venezuela, because it's going to be very difficult to be successful after an election or any sort of transition. And by the way, ideally, that's what I want it to be. The change in Venezuela, I want it to be at the ballot box. I don't prefer it be any other way. It may end up being another way, but that's the way I prefer it. It would be better for Venezuela if it was at the ballot box. But even if that were to occur, the societal challenges they face are extraordinary. And if those aren't confronted, that new government is going to fail, creating even further problems. And so the creation and the authorization of this fund so that it is available to provide assistance as soon as we're allowed to provide it. I think it also has the impact of helping our allies in the region. The last thing Colombia needs is a migratory crisis at its own border. It already faces significant challenges internally in the implementation of a peace plan and all the other challenges faced by some of these cartels that have emerged in areas where the FARC has decided to pull out. The last thing Brazil needs is a challenge. The last thing Guyana needs is a challenge of migratory pressure. And so that's also of assistance to them. So we have authored that bill. It's now in place, and we want to authorize the money so that then obviously we have to go out and make sure that it's in place and prepared to provide the aid if necessary. But I think this is an important moment for the region, and America's voice is important, and we should lead. And I've been pleasantly surprised that despite whatever people's political views, I know there are different views in this room about the current administration, I will say this to you. I was able to take Lilian Tintori to visit the president, who is the wife of Leopoldo Lopez, and I have received multiple reports from leaders in the region that when they meet with the president, he always asks about Venezuela. Now, I don't know if that meeting is what had that impact or something else did, but that's good news. The open-mindedness that exists in the administration beyond the White House, into the State Department and the National Security Council and the other divisions to do something with regards to this and give it the regional importance it deserves is promising. We have to follow through on it, and that's what I'm working on. But it's important. America's voice is important. But I think the most promising development I've seen is the nations in the region, the democracies in the region willing to stand up and condemn it. And I think that's had even a greater impact than in many cases some of the things that we have done. And I hope that that will continue. One of the best ways to create stronger ties with our allies in the region is to start doing things together, is to start engaging together in products and in projects of joint interest. And I think democracy in Venezuela should be one of them. And so in many ways, I think it's been a promising exercise in that regard as well. All right. I thank you for your time. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, as the senator is exiting, along with Andres, would you please join me one more time in a round of applause for his terrific comments. Y'all are such a well-behaved